Japanese prisoners of war arrived in America expecting torture and execution. What happened instead made them think they'd been transported to another planet. Some of them literally refused to believe they were still on Earth. Spring 1943. A group of Japanese soldiers captured in the Pacific are loaded onto a transport ship heading east. They've been told nothing about where they're going. Most of them have already tried to kill themselves because that's what they've been taught to do if captured. The ones who survived their suicide attempts are confused and ashamed. According to everything they know about war, they should be dead already. Instead, they're on a ship with American guards who keep offering them cigarettes and asking if they're hungry. Nothing makes sense, and it's about to get so much worse. To understand what happened to these prisoners, you need to understand what they expected. The Japanese military in World War II taught their soldiers that being captured was worse than death. Not just bad, not just shameful, literally worse than dying. They were told that if they were captured, they would be tortured in ways too horrible to describe. Their families back home would be disgraced forever. Their ancestors would be ashamed. The emperor himself would turn his face away from them. Death was mercy. Capture was eternal damnation. This wasn't just propaganda. This was drilled into every single Japanese soldier from day one of training. Officers would give speeches about how the enemy, especially Americans, were savages who would do unspeakable things to prisoners. They showed fake photographs of tortured soldiers. They told stories about prisoners being slowly killed for entertainment. The message was crystal clear. If you're about to be captured, kill yourself. Use your last grenade. Use your rifle. Use a rock. Just don't let them take you alive. So when Japanese soldiers did get captured, usually because they were unconscious or too wounded to resist, they woke up expecting horror. They expected pain. They expected to die slowly. What they got instead would shatter everything they thought they knew about the world. The first shock came during transport. American guards treated wounded prisoners, like actually treated them, gave them medical care, clean bandages, pain medication, food, water. Japanese soldiers had been taught that Americans would let prisoners die of their wounds or worse, would torture wounded men for information. Instead, American medics were trying to save their lives. Some prisoners thought this was a trick. They'd get you healthy just so they could torture you properly later. But the torture never came. Then came THE Chinese letter VOYAGE to America. Prisoners were kept in the hold of transport ships, sure, but they were given blankets, regular meals, and access to basic sanitation. Again, this made no sense. Why waste resources on enemy prisoners? Japanese prisoners in Japanese custody barely got fed. Enemy prisoners would get even less. That was logical. That was how war worked. But the Americans were feeding them the same rations American soldiers ate. Some of the Japanese prisoners thought the food must be poisoned. Why else would the enemy feed them this well? When the ships finally arrived in America, that's when things got really strange. The prisoners were loaded onto trains, not cattle cars, not cages, actual passenger trains, with seats and windows. The Japanese prisoners looked out those windows as the train moved inland, and what they saw contradicted everything they'd been told about America. The first thing that shocked Japanese prisoners was how much food there was. They'd been told that America was starving because of the war, that the American people were suffering, that their economy was collapsing, that Japan was winning. The propaganda back home showed Americans standing in bread lines, desperate and hungry. But looking out the train windows, the prisoners saw farms overflowing with crops. They saw cattle grazing in huge herds. They saw towns that looked prosperous and untouched by war. No bomb damage, no destroyed buildings. Everyone they saw looked healthy and well-fed. One prisoner later wrote that he thought the Americans must have built fake towns along the train route just to trick them, because this couldn't be real. Japan was supposed to be winning. America was supposed to be on the verge of collapse, but everything he was seeing suggested that America hadn't even noticed there was a war going on. The country looked completely normal, more than normal. It looked rich. The trains took the prisoners to camps scattered across the American interior. These camps were usually in remote areas, far from the coasts, places where escape would be pointless even if you tried. But here's the thing that really messed with the prisoners' heads. The camps weren't torture facilities. They were just camps. Fenced in, sure. Guarded, obviously. But inside the fences, prisoners had barracks with real beds, bathrooms with running water, mess halls that served 3 meals a day, and in some camps, access to recreation areas. Let me be clear about something. These weren't luxury resorts. They were prison camps. Prisoners couldn't leave, they had to follow rules, and life was strictly controlled. But compared to what Japanese soldiers had been told to expect, compared to what they thought American captivity would be like, these camps might as well have been hotels. The first meal was always a shock. Japanese prisoners would line up in the mess hall expecting to get a bowl of rice if they were lucky, maybe some thin soup. Instead, they got plates piled with food, meat, vegetables, bread, more food than many of them had seen in months of combat in the Pacific, where Japanese supply lines were constantly cut and soldiers were often half-starving. Some prisoners refused to eat at first, convinced it was poisoned or drugged. Others ate and then waited to die. When they didn't die, when they woke up the next morning still alive and were offered breakfast, the psychological impact was huge. A Japanese officer captured at Guadalcanal later described his first week in an American POW camp. He said he kept waiting for the torture to begin. Every time guards approached, he assumed this was it. This was when they'd start beating him or dragging him off to some dungeon. Instead, the guards asked if he needed anything. Did he want to write a letter home? Did he need to see a doctor? Was the food okay? He thought they were playing mind games, trying to make him lower his guard. After a week, he realized they weren't playing games. This was just how they ran the camp. The Red Cross had access to the camps. International observers could visit. The Americans were following the Geneva Convention rules for prisoners of war, which Japan had never signed and didn't follow. Japanese prisoners didn't know what the Geneva Convention was. The concept that there were international rules about how to treat prisoners seemed insane to them. You captured enemy soldiers and you did whatever you wanted with them. That's how it worked. The idea that there were supposed to be standards and that America was actually following those standards was completely foreign. But here's where it gets really interesting. The Americans didn't just keep prisoners alive. They tried to keep them busy and mentally healthy. Prisoners were allowed to form work details that earned them small amounts of money. They could buy things at the camp commissary: candy, cigarettes, toiletries. They could play sports. Some camps had baseball diamonds. Japanese prisoners played baseball against each other while American guards watched and sometimes cheered. Think about how surreal that must have been. You're an enemy soldier, captured in battle, expecting torture and death, and instead you're playing baseball and earning money to buy Hershey bars. Some camps let prisoners tend gardens. They could grow vegetables and flowers. There are photographs of Japanese prisoners in American camps carefully maintaining traditional Japanese gardens, and American guards helping them get the plants they needed. Why? Because the camp psychologists said it was good for morale and mental health. The Americans were concerned about the mental health of enemy prisoners. Japanese soldiers had never heard of such a thing. Mail was another shock. Prisoners were allowed to write letters home through the Red Cross. The letters were censored, obviously, but they went through. Japanese prisoners could tell their families they were alive. This was huge because back in Japan, most of these men had been declared dead. Their families had held funerals. They'd been erased from family records because the shame of capture was too great. But now they could write home and say, actually, I'm alive. I'm in America. I'm okay. Not all families responded well. Some prisoners got letters back telling them they were dead to their family, that they should have killed themselves, that they'd brought eternal shame. But others got letters saying, we're glad you're alive, we don't care about the shame, just come home. That started changing some prisoners' perspectives on what they'd been taught. The American guards were another source of constant confusion. Japanese soldiers had been taught that Americans were racist savages who hated all Japanese people and would treat prisoners with cruelty. Some of that racism definitely existed. There were American guards who hated the prisoners and treated them badly, but most guards were just guys doing a job. They were bored young men stuck in the middle of nowhere guarding enemy prisoners, and a lot of them ended up just talking to the prisoners to pass the time. Japanese prisoners who spoke some English would have conversations with guards. The guards would show them pictures of their families back home. They'd complain about the food, about being stuck on guard duty instead of seeing combat, about their girlfriends back home. They'd trade cigarettes for help with chores. They'd ask the prisoners about Japan, about Japanese culture, about what life was like before the war. These weren't the interactions between captor and prisoner that Japanese soldiers had been trained to expect. These were just guys from different countries talking to each other. One prisoner described a guard who was obsessed with learning Japanese. This American soldier would spend his breaks trying to learn Japanese words from the prisoners, butchering the pronunciation, laughing when he got it wrong. He'd teach them English slang in return. The prisoner said it was the most confusing experience of his life because he couldn't reconcile this friendly, goofy American trying to learn his language with the monster savages he'd been told about in training. As months passed, prisoners started to realize something that really shook their understanding of the war. America wasn't struggling at all. The guards would talk about rationing back home, sure. You couldn't buy as much sugar or gasoline as you wanted, but that was it. That was the extent of American suffering. Meanwhile, these prisoners knew that Japan was being bombed, that cities were burning, that civilians were starving. The contrast was staggering. Prisoners who worked outside the camps, doing agricultural labor or other jobs, saw even more. They saw American farms with machinery that did the work of 100 men. They saw American towns where every house had electricity and running water. They saw highways filled with cars and trucks. They saw factories in the distance running 24 hours a day, churning out war materials. The scale of American industrial power was something Japanese soldiers had never imagined. They'd been told Japan's warrior spirit would overcome America's materialism. But seeing that materialism up close, seeing the sheer abundance of everything, made them realize that warrior spirit couldn't compete with this. Some prisoners started to suspect they'd been lied to about everything. If America wasn't the collapsing, starving, weak nation they'd been told about, what else was a lie? Were the reports of Japanese victories accurate? Was Japan actually winning? Looking at American strength up close made that seem unlikely. The psychological impact of all this varied by prisoner. Some doubled down on their beliefs. They decided this was all an elaborate trick, that the Americans were trying to break their spirit with kindness. These prisoners refused to cooperate, refused to work, maintained strict military discipline among themselves, and waited for Japan to win the war and rescue them. But others started to question. If everything they'd been told about America was wrong, maybe everything they'd been told about the war was wrong too. American intelligence officers ran what they called re-education programs for prisoners who seemed receptive. These weren't torture sessions. They were basically classes where prisoners could learn about democracy, about American history, about international law. Prisoners could attend voluntarily. Many refused, but some went out of curiosity, and what they learned there challenged everything they'd been taught. There were Japanese prisoners who'd been teachers or professors before the war, educated men who'd been drafted. These prisoners started having quiet conversations with each other, comparing notes, trying to figure out what was true and what was propaganda. They realized that the Japanese military had lied to them about almost everything regarding America. The question was, what else had they been lied to about? By 1944, as the war turned increasingly against Japan, prisoners in American camps had access to information that most Japanese citizens didn't. They could read American newspapers in the camp libraries. They could see newsreels showing American victories. They knew that Japan was losing, badly, even though Japanese propaganda back home still claimed victory was near. Some prisoners tried to warn their families in letters that Japan needed to surrender. Those letters were censored, but the fact that prisoners even thought to write them shows how much their perspective had changed. The real moment of crisis came in August 1945. When news of Hiroshima reached the camps, prisoners didn't believe it at first. An entire city destroyed by one bomb. Impossible. That had to be American propaganda. But when Nagasaki was bombed days later, and then Japan announced its surrender, the psychological impact on the prisoners was devastating. Everything they'd suffered for, everyone they'd watched die, all the sacrifices, all the warrior spirit, all the promises of victory, it had all been for nothing. Japan had lost. The emperor, who was supposed to be divine, who could never be defeated, had surrendered. For Japanese soldiers raised to believe that death was preferable to surrender, having their own emperor surrender was incomprehensible. The reaction in the camps varied wildly. Some prisoners tried to kill themselves. They'd survived this long in captivity, endured the shame, stayed alive hopping for rescue or victory, and now it was all pointless. Others felt relief. The war was over. They could go home. They might see their families again. But many prisoners felt something more complicated. They felt angry at having been lied to. Angry that they'd been prepared to die for a cause that was never as righteous as they'd been told. Angry that their leaders had wasted so many lives for nothing. American camp commanders had to handle this situation carefully. You had thousands of enemy soldiers who just learned their country surrendered, trapped in camps in the middle of America, and nobody knew how they'd react. But here's what happened. Most prisoners just wanted to go home. The Americans started processing them for repatriation as quickly as possible, and most prisoners cooperated. They'd seen enough of America by this point to know that resistance was pointless and also unnecessary. The war was over, they just wanted to leave. But going home presented its own problems. These prisoners had to return to a Japan that had been firebombed into rubble, occupied by American forces, and completely transformed from the country they'd left. And they had to return as men who'd surrendered, who'd been captured, who'd lived comfortably in enemy hands while their countrymen suffered and died. The shame was still there, even if the war was over. Japanese prisoners who returned home after the war carried with them a strange perspective. They'd seen the enemy up close, had been treated as human beings by the people they'd been taught to hate, and had witnessed firsthand the massive gap between what they'd been told and what was actually true. Many of these former prisoners struggled to readjust to Japanese society. Some were rejected by their families and communities because of the shame of capture. Others became advocates for democracy and peace, having seen an alternative to the militaristic culture they'd grown up in. The really interesting part is what happened years later. Starting in the 1960s and 70s, some of these former prisoners started writing memoirs and giving interviews about their experiences. And a common theme emerged. Their first days in America, expecting torture and death, being given food and shelter instead. Realizing that everything they'd been taught was a lie, those experiences had fundamentally changed how they saw the world. They'd been on the receiving end of an enemy's mercy, when their own military had taught them that mercy was weakness. There are interviews with these men where they talk about how the cognitive dissonance of those first days nearly broke them. Your entire worldview, everything you've been taught to believe, everything you've risked your life for, revealed as false in the span of a single meal in an American mess hall. That's a psychological earthquake. Some men never recovered from it. Others used it as the foundation for completely rebuilding their understanding of war, culture, and humanity. The United States held over 5,000 Japanese prisoners during World War II. Most eventually returned to Japan. Some chose to stay in America. A few became American citizens. But all of them carried the memory of arriving in America expecting hell and finding something completely different. Not paradise, not heaven, just a prison camp run by people who followed rules and treated them like human beings instead of animals. For men who'd been taught that the enemy was subhuman, that simple recognition of their humanity was more shocking than any torture could have been. Hit subscribe to see what happened when these prisoners finally returned to Japan.